Scan. I think that looks like most people are in and connected. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending this morning's session. Sorry it's an early start, but we thought this was probably the best way to run this clinic this morning, this session. The webinar is being recorded. Slides and resources will be shared afterwards. So whilst you'll be invited to take notes, you will get as many of the resources as possible we can share after the session as well. At this stage, everybody is muted. If I could ask that it stays this way at this stage, it'll allow us to run through the presentation in its entirety. I thought just very briefly, just mention the acute label stocks shortages impacting the industry. To let you know, BPIF labels and BPIF cartons have made BAYS aware of this situation and the serious impact that the supply chains will face in the coming weeks and months. And we've also been in touch with the mills via our relationship with FINAT and Intergraph and across both DEFRA and other packaging federations. So we are keeping everybody informed on this. We're aware of how serious it is. If you need further advice, reach out to your regional director, Graham, or your HR advisors for support in the coming weeks on that. However, today we're going to focus on the plastic packaging tax and in particular its impact on the roll label sector. We are going to host further sessions on looking at impact on cartons, points of sale and commercial prints. So you're invited to join those as many times as you want to invite colleagues onto those. We also have a session on the 10th of March at 10 AM. And here we've managed to agree with the HMRC to hold a presentation directly for the print sector. So we'll have two speakers from HMRC talking about the print sector implications of PPT. Again, further opportunity for some questions that we are putting to HMRC, so please do also register for that one. Introductions for today, we have, I'm Darren Shepherd, I'm Regional Director for the North. We've got Graham Backhouse, General Manager for BPIF Labels, John Clark, General Manager for BPIF Cartons. Graham and John will be in the hot seat for questions afterwards. And Mika, Walwyn Lewis and myself will be managing the question process. If I could suggest that Graham is allowed to deliver his presentation in full, it's only about 10 minutes. They'll give a backstory, some full sort of understanding of PPT, quite a basic level. However, it'll be label specific, which is the most important part. And then if we could use the raise hand function, and Mika and myself will invite people to ask questions. Now they could be on further discussion on PPT, or maybe you've got an application that you want some advice on. So we'll take those questions. We don't have an exact hard stop, but the aim is to keep this there about 30 minutes. But we'll take questions today offline or follow up afterwards as required. So at this stage, if I can pass over to Graham for the presentation, please. We'll catch up later.
Right, so. Is that okay?
Good.
Okay. Bear with me one moment. I'll just give you a moment to read that. Basically, what we're saying here is that all the information that we're going to mention to you today has been confirmed by HMRC in one way or another. But just be aware that we found they've been inconsistent in answering questions and in their webinars and in written responses. So just bear that in mind, because it is a thing that's changing all the time as we move along. So just to look at what we're going to cover today, basically, and I know that some of you have registered, have already been in touch with us, and we know that you know quite a bit about PPT. Some of you will know a lot less, but we'll just cover the tax basics, then look at some of the label specifics, look at some of the actions we've been taking and some comments that we'd like to make on that. Then have a look at where you can get extra help, and then we'll go in after that, after the end of the presentation, for your questions. Hopefully running through this will take about 10 minutes if I get on with it fairly quickly, so we'll do our best. So all companies that import or manufacture plastic packaging will need to keep records to prove their PPT tax status. All plastic that does not contain 30% or more recycled material will qualify for plastic packaging tax. And companies importing or manufacturing more than 10 tons of finished components in a 12-month period will need to register for PPT. Do not register until you reach the 10-ton de minimis calculated from the 1st of April 2022. And then you pay tax on qualifying finished components from the date you recognise the need to register. Tax-exempt recycled plastic must be included when calculating if you have reached the 10-ton de minimis registration trigger. So even if you did 10 tonnes of completely recycled material, which tax would not be payable on, you still need to register and you will still need to record that. You calculate reaching the de minimis and paying tax on weights of finished components, not what you purchase. Tax on components due for export can be deferred for up to 12 months. If not exported in 12 months, then you'll have to pay the tax. Tax can be reclaimed on exported items up to 24 months after the last substantial modification. The company who pays PPT is the only company who can claim the tax back. You'll need to keep records on the specifications of your plastic materials, any tax paid, the amount of plastic by weight for each order shipped, and if the product is being exported. HMRC are pretty keen on due diligence. They're coming across as they're going to get fairly hard on that. I doubt if that will be in the first year, but I think in due course that they will do. The tax point, who pays the tax, is determined by who performs the last substantial modification in the component supply chain, but before the packing, filling and labelling stage. So modifications, even substantial modifications, are disregarded at the packing, filling and labelling stages. Components containing multiple substances will be subject to tax on the whole component if a qualifying plastic is the largest substance by weight. Now, there's a lot more guidance on this on HMRC, but basically if you've got something made up of 3 components, 4 grams of plastic, say 3 grams of paper, 3 grams of aluminium, plastic is the largest because it's 4 grams as opposed to 3 and 3. PPT is payable on the whole 10 grams then of that material. So HMRC, as I said earlier, are stressing due diligence in testing and verifying the specifications and information you use for calculations. You will need proof if challenged. They are accepting suppliers' specifications and various other forms of proof. Again, there's a lot more information of that on their website. But they are also saying that you need to do due diligence to challenge those specifications and make sure they are correct. HMRC have dropped the requirement to show PPT on your invoices. We suggest good practice would be to state PPT has been paid where it has been and include the amount paid. You can pass on the PPT in your prices or as a separate line in your invoice. VAT is payable on all PPT passed on to your customers. So let's look at now 1 or 2 label specific issues. So labels manufactured of filmic materials are in scope of the tax. Laminating and printing are both substantial modifications, and therefore label converters are likely to make the last substantial modification to a plastic label. Plastic face materials and plastic backers are being treated as 2 separate components, but both come under the scope of PPT. A printer converter who prints, foils or laminates a label will make a significant modification and will most likely be liable for the tax because the next stage is most likely to be the packing and filling stage. Die cutting, slitting and waste stripping are not significant modifications, so it follows that the PPT tax on plain filmic labels will be with the importer or manufacturer of the laminate, not with the printer. And this is going to cause some issues, we feel, through the supply chain and is causing a certain amount of confusion, as is the fact that die cutting, slitting and waste stripping are not significant modifications. Unless the backer is printed or undergoes some other significant modification, it will be the laminate producer importer who will need to pay the PPT, not the label printer. We've challenged with HMRC about printing things like date codes and reference marks on the backing paper, they say they will ignore that as printing, so that the backing tax would still, the PPT tax would be still paid on the backer by the supplier. Adhesive should be included in the weight calculations for plastic face materials when reporting on and paying PPT. Silicone should be included in the weight of the backing material. We have challenged both these things with HMRC, and they're adamant that, that they have to be included. Although the silicone is such an insignificant amount, I doubt if there's going to be much problems with that. They have also pointed out that if an adhesive is more weight than the face material, so you've got a very heavy adhesive coat weight, you can't use that to disregard the material for tax. So information you'll need from your supplier. You're probably going to need the face material type, face material weight in GSM, face material proof of recycled content, adhesive weight in grams per square meter, and the backing material type, backing material weight, similar specifications. And you're going to want details of any PPT that's already been paid. So getting help. HMRC continue to build information resources, and the best place to start is HMRC Plastics Packaging Tax Collections page. And we'll send you details of all these and where you can link to those if you're not someone who's already got those connections. They have had issued for some time 8 recommended steps for you to establish your PPT status, and they are linked from that collections page that I mentioned above. Look at the PPT section on the BPIF website. There's a whole section there that's starting to build and build links to HMRC and various other places. We have an email helpline, PPT helpline, and again, we'll send you details of this after today's session. HMRC have their own dedicated email address. Many of you have probably already been using that. You can also register to receive automatic updates from HMRC, and you can use this to ask specific questions where you've got a situation that you're unclear of. They were taking several weeks to answer. They then picked up and seemed to reply within a few days. I've had a question in there now for 3 weeks and I still haven't had an answer on that, so I'm not sure what's happening. HMRC recently updated the 2 decision tree documents that they issued, so we'll include these in the follow-up documentation as well. And we'll email you a PDF of the PowerPoint presentation together with website links and email addresses. HMRC and BPIF are hosting a joint webinar. I think it was mentioned by Darren earlier, on Thursday the 10th of March at 10 AM. Registration link will be included in the follow-up information. So there will be HMRC representatives on that, along with BPIF, where they've offered to do this joint webinar with us, and it will be another opportunity to answer questions. And HMRC have issued a frequently asked questions document. We'll share the latest version of that with you at the end. So really, that is it. We're over to your questions. Thank you all for taking the time to listen.
Thank you, Graham. Yeah, if you can drop that webinar, the presentation down, and then we can see the questions. So if I'd invite anybody who's got any questions, if you can use the raise hand function, anything that you've come across at the moment where you're trying to understand the implications and how you'd actually go about the process of applying it in a specific situation. One which I just threw on the table, Graham, one that I was asked, I think, last week that we covered, was the implications of labels. So let's assume a label is printed and either completed or part completed, and then goes into a warehousing function or may sit in the finishing function for a period of time. What's the implications there? When is PPT paid?
The PPT will be paid immediately after the last substantial modification. That's the rules. That question, I think, Darren, you actually put it to them yourself at one stage, but they think the answers we've got back eventually from them are that if a product is PPT is paid after substantial modification has been made. It then can sit in a warehouse. If that product is subsequently destroyed, there is no mechanism for claiming PPT back on that, unfortunately.
So PPT becomes paid at the point of printing, usually within the process, or laminating, irrespective of warehousing or finishing.
Yeah.
Okay. I think there's one on the chat. Right. Message from Katie. Is it possible that they will ask for it to show on the invoice in the future? So I think this is a question around displaying PPT tax on invoices. There's some guidance, I believe.
Yeah, it was originally destined to be that you had to include it on the invoice, and HMRC dropped that partway through the process of bringing this tax in. And so they've said now, and we're not sure the real reasons why, but they've said now that you don't have to include it on the invoice at the moment. We're saying it's good practice to do that. And we also believe that HMRC will bring that back. There are indications that they might bring that request back, that requirement back in the second year. So I think it's probably best if people proceed with the idea that they're going to have to put it on there at some point if they don't do it immediately.
Because the cost will have to be included, of course, anyway, won't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Aaron, it's John. Can I just sort of point out that there is a facility within the PPT process that you only pay the tax on the actual finished product, so you don't pay it on any production waste. But, and this is the big but, you have to tell your supplier before the event as to what production waste you are expecting. So for example, if a label supplier supplies the material and you expect 10% process waste, then you can tell your supplier that he only has to charge 90% PPT. But the whole problem in this is that you do need to inform your supplier before the actual process takes place. So it's going to be a bit of a finger in the air, but you're going to have to be able to justify any decisions that you make to HMRC.
Understood.
Hi, Grant, you've got a question, Grant Picking. If you unmute, you'll be able to ask your question.
I have. Morning to all. Just picking up on the point you said about claiming back tax. So obviously as a label converter, we'll obviously have to pay the plastic tax to the HMRC. I've been challenged by a couple of our customers saying we need to tell them how much and what that is so that they can claim it back themselves. But just listening to the PowerPoint presentation, I got the impression that they couldn't do that because they haven't paid it. It's Berkshire Labels that have paid that. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. We've challenged this a few times or discussed this a few times, and it's been brought up a few times. HMRC are adamant that the only people who can reclaim tax are the people who paid the tax. And this presents itself with a real problem, particularly on exported items, because as you can imagine, if you're a company that manufactures labels, sends them into Unilever with a multilingual label, there, they apply it to their product. It sits in a warehouse in the UK and they will ship to several countries at different times. The only way you can claim the tax back on that exported item, assuming it is exported at some point, is for that information and with proof to come back to you that that item has been exported. You can then claim the tax back if you were the person that was paying it under the current rules. And we've discussed this with them. We've said it's going to be impossible to work through the industry. What's going to happen is that tax is going to be paid on items that are not reclaimed, on items where they could be reclaimed. Because what do you think the chances are of Unilever or someone like that, just using them as an example, feeding that information back through the supply chain to you, the person that paid the tax, with the details you need to actually be able to reclaim the tax? It's just not going to happen, I don't think.
I think I think it's almost, from our perspective, the most partial labels, and I see Stuart Kellock on from Label Appeals, so it'll be interesting at some point to get his take on this, but I think it's almost going to be impossible for us to itemise out on invoices. You know, that it's so complex with customers in terms of an invoice might contain paper and plastic labels, and to itemise that down to individual tax paid on each line, and I think it's almost going to be impossible for us to do that. I just don't understand. As I say, it'd be interesting to see what other label companies' take would be on that, but it's just a minefield. I just don't know how we'll ever, you said about good practice, to start telling them what we paid, but yeah, you know, one invoice could contain 30 lines of different, you know, maybe it's called off from different stocks and materials. It's just, I just don't understand how we'll ever be able to do that, but maybe we're missing a trick. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the requirement from HMRC when it does come in, if it does come back in, will only be an overall tax paid thing. It won't be necessarily line by line, but we don't know that. But obviously, if you're shipping items that some of which may be exported, some of which may not, you're in a way ideally would want to itemize the tax so that, you know, the possibility of it being reclaimed at some point is clear to everyone. The process of passing information up and down the line, which HMRC visualize, is saying you must have vision, you know, of what tax has been paid, of the specifications, and then, you know, whether the product's going to be exported or not, is going to be quite difficult. If you know the product is definitely going to be exported, you can defer the tax until it is. But once it's paid, I think the chances of recovering that's going to be quite slow.
Okay, thank you.
Is that okay, Grant? Thank you. Yeah, I'll just take one from the text box first, and perhaps Stuart will take Stuart's question. So, message from Lee: could we ask HMRC to make die cutting a substantial modification, and therefore, as an industry, we would be far more consistent on when tax will be paid?
I think there's a lot of feeling that that die cutting should be and under the rules, and I think you're right. It would move the tax point certainly to one place on that, because all the labels will be die cut, and there is an argument that it would be better all in one place, either with the suppliers or with the end user, the printer. The way that HMRC have done this, you need to understand that when they set out with this, they didn't really understand our industry at all, and that was quite clear from the conversations we had with them. They've learned more as we've been communicating with them, and they've got more into it with other people. But yes, I don't think there's any chance of HMRC changing tax design at the moment. They are adamant they won't look at tax design issues at the moment, but I think they'll find themselves with all sorts of problems over the first 12 months that it will have to get revisited. But that's just my opinion.
Thank you. Mika?
Stuart Kellock, would you like to ask your question? You've got your hand up, you're next.
Yeah, good morning. First thing to say, I just want to say a quick thank you to BPIF for organising these webinars and doing such a great job on distributing the information. But just picking up on one significant point, that, you know, not paying tax on the waste, but we've got to tell the supplier of the product before we actually do the conversion. It's just never going to work, is it? I mean, you get to a point where you're not going to be able to do it. We're working on just in time, or did before they stopped supplying material. Has anybody got any thoughts on how you're going to manage that process of actually giving information back down to the supplier on what your waste trim is going to be? Given that your waste trim, certainly for people like us, we'll buy in a stock of paper and use it on probably anywhere between 20 and 50 jobs. The mind boggles at how that's going to work. I was wondering if anybody had any thoughts.
I'm happy to say something, but I don't know if anyone's got any different views on it. I think, Stuart, one of the things is quite clear, that this isn't going to work very well in the way that HMRC are dictating it across the label industry. It really, really does have a number of inbuilt issues with it. yeah, it is impossible in our industry, in my view, having spent a long time in it, to communicate those sorts of pieces of information backwards and forwards, up and down the supply chain. And I think the result of that will be that people will just pay the tax. My concern on that is that at some point in the future, if the government stroke HMRC don't get the result they want, which, remembering, that is to move more people to recycled content, they will just up the price. They'll just say, well, it's going to be £400 a tonne, £600 a tonne, £800 a tonne, until the pain somewhere along the supply chain is such that something is done about it. I just thought
they may have reached that point already, Graham.
Yeah, it is a very difficult one, and you know, we've been telling them that we recognise real problems in our industry, particularly in the label side. We recognise real problems with this, and the way in applying it in the way in which they envisage it will work, and we say it won't work. And you know, the other problem we've got, and I'm beginning to wonder whether I missed it off one of the slides, my own slides. The other problem we've got is that, you know, across the industry, all sorts of people are interpreting this differently. There's different levels of knowledge at the moment. Some people are just starting out on it. We've had some fairly large companies very recently just say, it doesn't apply to us. Well, yes, it does. And, you know, it won't apply to every company, because not every company will buy those quantities of material. From my conversations with the suppliers, they think that some of the big suppliers think it affects about 20% of their customers in terms of reaching the de minimis. But everybody who produces a plastic component has to do a certain amount of recording to prove that they don't reach the de minimis.
Yeah. I didn't know whether it might be worth talking to HMRC about having some industry standards when it came to this waste and other items as well. So, you know, we come up with a nominal figure, which we then say, right, well, that is a reasonable reflection of the industry. Like 10% or something like that. I mean, that's just a number plucked out of the air. I just wondered if there was any way we could probably get a conversation started with HMRC along those lines.
Sadly to say, Stuart, we've already had it some time ago. We managed at one point to get a direct meeting, such as the discussions we're having now, with HMRC, and that was raised, and they asked me to provide some information, background to the industry, because that was what the point at which we really did for sure realise they just don't understand the label industry and how it works. So they asked me for some background information, which I put together about the industry, how it works, where the supply points are, how the construction of a material, and they wanted some weights and information on weights of materials and the range of materials. And they came back with a ruling saying, you know, no, you'll have to calculate the waste each time. You can't have a general, you know, it's 10% or whatever, which I think is the wrong approach. And I think they may have to change their minds on, but we did raise that very early on and got the answer we didn't want from them.
Which then begs the question, how many people are they going to have out there ferreting through my books, checking that I've not just put a nominal figure in there? Because that seems like an awful lot of work on their part.
I think, obviously, if you ask them the question, they say, look, we don't want to hit people hard. We want to help them get the tax right. We want to help them do this. We want to help them do that. But if there is blatant disregard for it trying to implement PPT, we will prosecute. The reality is, I think they're a long, long way away from getting to grips with this, and a long, long way away from actually getting to the point of prosecuting anybody, not least of which they can't even answer their own questions consistently. So, you know, in answer to your question, I think it'll happen one day, but it won't be, in my view, in the next year.
Right, okay. Thank you, Joe. Thanks for all the hard work and the answers to the questions. Appreciate that.
I'll just pick one from the text and then we'll drop over to Matt, if that's okay, Matt. So the question is, are plain labels, i.e. only die cut, stripped and not printed, not subject to PPT? The PPT is covered by the supplier. So I guess really the question around blank labels, die cut and stripped, Graham, can you just clarify, please?
Yeah, again, we have actually gone to a great deal of trouble with HMRC to get rulings on this, and we've challenged it. The rule is that if you don't make a substantial modification, you don't pay the tax, and therefore the tax point moves back down the supply chain to the last substantial modification. So in the terms of a plain label, because they've said that die cutting, waste stripping is not a substantial modification, slitting is not a substantial modification. If you just die cut a plain label, strip away the waste, slit it into reels and send it out, then you don't create a tax point. And if you don't create a tax point, it goes back to the previous substantial modification, which would be with either the importer, if it's an imported finished material, or it would be the manufacturer or the person who puts the laminate together in the UK. And that in itself just causes tremendous problems. Because people buy materials, put them in their warehouse, and they don't know maybe at that point whether they're going to print on them or not.
Sure. John, have you got a point to add to that? Sorry, I saw your hand.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out that in answer to that last question, PPT is still payable on that plain label, but it's not the printer who actually pays the PPT.
Yeah.
It will be the importer or the manufacturer. And I think it's worth, again, sort of clarifying for everybody that under the plastics packaging tax, there is joint and several liability in this tax. So it's in your interest to make sure that your supplier is actually paying the tax when it's due to be paid by them, because otherwise HMRC could come gunning for you. You know, tax is only payable once in the supply chain, but you know, if the supplier isn't doing what they should be doing, then HMRC will look to you to make up that shortfall. Thanks, Darren.
Good point, John.
Thanks, John. Matt Das, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, Mika. I just wanted to follow up on a couple of things that have just been mentioned already. Just to Stuart's point about how we inform the supplier about our production waste. Like Stuart said, nigh on impossible to do that for all the production jobs. We're in a similar situation to what Stuart said, where that material will be used across a number of jobs. And the only way that I could see that that would work is as a percentage, but it sounds like we've already gone down that route, and that's not been accepted. But just to go back a little bit further about the finished goods, and if they never actually then get used and get thrown away. So I'm talking mainly about incidental stock that we'll run jobs for, that will then sit in our warehouse, actually printed on plastic. But then if the customer never calls them off, they're often noticed to destroy. So we will then put them into the waste stream. So I think what you were saying earlier is that the tax is still applicable on that, even if you never sell that label. Is that right? That
is correct, as we have been told at the moment. Yeah, it was raised by another customer who regularly produces batches, puts some into stock, and they were asking the question, if this then becomes obsolete stock and is never called off, can we reclaim the tax back on it? And HMRC came back and saying no. The point at which you pay tax is immediately after the substantial modification. So it will be on the return that follows when you actually produce that label, and that's when you will pay the tax. And if you've then got it in the warehouse, currently there is no mechanism for reclaiming tax on something that's subsequently destroyed and never shipped to the customer.
So it begs the question whether we include that incidental stock as the production waste.
Well, yeah, I think it's going to be difficult, because I think the way they'll look at it is obviously they'll know the square. You'll have to give them the square meterage of the materials in the finished product, which will be calculated by the size of the label.
Well, at that point, we don't know whether it's waste or not, do we? That's the point.
Yeah, I suppose so. I suppose so, but yeah, I'm not going to get into that one, Matt.
Yeah, no, it's a complex one, isn't it? And just a final point, really, just given the current situation with materials, do you think it's about time the HMRC revised their decision tree in terms of whether labels are an integral part of a product or not, given the fact that some products might not have labels on in the near future regarding the lack of materials?
Yeah, these are the sort of questions that they just shun off. They just go around them. You know, I don't think there's any opportunity to get them to change much at the moment. I think we're all going to have to go through the pain of it being demonstrated that this doesn't work. That's my sad view about it. I'll give you an example. You know, we have challenged the backing paper quite strongly and said that it should be regarded as waste, because at some point in time it will always become waste. You know, at the point of application of the label, it's waste, and we put a strong argument in, to the point where HMRC did actually say, we'll go away and look at this. But then they came back with obviously a well thought out reasoning as to why you shouldn't. And you'll notice in some communications, I had a customer speak to me recently saying, you know, it was being described as packaging for the label, and that's the way they're now describing the backing paper, as packaging for the label, just really to change the wording around it. But they're adamant that it will remain liable for tax.
Yeah.
So I'll just take one from the chat function. What happens if exported labels on which credit has been claimed subsequently end up back in the UK market? Is any adjustment required?
Well, whoever imports the labels will then re-imports the labels, if in this particular case, will become liable to pay the PPT. They just treat it as a straightforward thing. You manufacture something, you export it, you don't have to pay tax on it, or you reclaim the tax because it's been subsequently exported within the 24-month period. If someone then re-imports that product, and questions have been asked because we have people who have processes in the UK, they then send it to Belgium and another process takes place and it comes back. And what HMRC have said consistently, to be fair to them, is when you export it, you can either claim the tax back or you don't pay it in the first place if it's in the first 12 months. When it comes back into the country, whoever is responsible for importing it back in then has to pay the tax again. Does that answer the question?
I think so, thank you.
Adrian, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, good morning. Yes, my question's a little bit odd. The end user, the actual end application, is there an assumption if the label is being used on an engine, for example, that it's exempt from the PPT? And then the other thing is, you did say about the joint and several disclosure. If the end user says that it's being used on an engine, but actually uses it as a packaging product, we are liable to the tax, for the tax then, if they lie to us and we don't check it out. How does that work?
Well, Adrian, I'm no lawyer, but I would assume that providing you've got some written evidence that they said they were going to use it for one purpose, you would be in the clear on that.
Okay. Well, the other thing, it's just the end use of the label that I'm just getting a bit concerned with, and where the definition is, where it's the packaging and an industrial label application. It's
been a bit of a grey area, and we do have a question, and it's the one I mentioned in the presentation that's outstanding for a few weeks now. And I've asked it on their webinars, and my question hasn't been answered on the webinar, strangely enough, on 2 or 3 occasions. But it's on behalf of a customer. It may even be yourselves that's put it to me. You know, they manufacture tags which are used to track components around an industrial situation, places like JCB, you know, car manufacturer, and places like that. And we've not got an answer on that because, you know, HMRC could sort of say that is being used to identify products through the supply chain, even though the supply chain is, you know, is a vehicle or something. So the short answer is, it is a question that's been raised previously, and we haven't got an answer on that. And I think we need to press that a little bit more with HMRC. It comes down to, I mean, it is a plastic component. It is technically a piece of packaging in one sense, but you're quite right. The use of it questions whether it should be taxed or not.
I'm going to add those to the list, Graham, for the 10th of March webinar. We'll try and capture some of these questions that are a bit vague, and we'll add them to the session for 10th of March, if that's okay.
It does draw into the conversation. A typical one is the blood bag label, which is a self-adhesive plastic label, but it's a functional label which somebody could argue, yes, it's a part of the packaging, but another side could argue, actually, no, that's a functional part of the method of storing the blood, and it's not part of the packaging. And it's going to, I think it's going to be really weird, some of the end user applications when the taxman has a look at them in particular.
Yeah, Adrian, this has been raised, the blood bag one, but it was raised in a different context, which was, can it be disregarded because it's medical? Because some are exempt if it's on a direct medicines. The answer to that one was no, quite clear from HMRC. It is still liable for tax under that vision of it. But yeah, I think there's going to be so many of these, and this is what we're concerned about, really.
And if the HMRC, if they said there's any amnesty at all for us all, because I'm sure that we, with all good intention, we're going to get it wrong. And it might be wrong in their favour and wrong in our favour, but I'm sure we're going to get some of this wrong.
They've not said there's an amnesty as such. What they are saying, they're reluctant, obviously, to say they're not going to take any action because, you know, they weaken their own position on that. But what they are saying is, look, for, you know, at this stage, we're only interested in helping people do the right thing. And I think they are genuine in that, in saying that. We're only interested in getting people to understand this, how it should work within their industry, and to do it. So again, personal opinion is, if you've been seen to make the effort to look at this and you're trying to do your best to work with it, then I think you ain't going to get prosecuted, because there's so many reasons why they couldn't do it and wouldn't want to do it at this stage. I think anybody who blatantly just said, you know what, I'm having none of this, I'm not even going to look at it, it's not my problem, I think they would take a different view even at this stage on that. But it would have to be very blatant disregard for it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Take care.
Two further questions on chat then. So I've read this one. I think it's saying that it's a label converter that imports blank plain labels, do they pay the tax at the point of import?
Sorry, can I just clarify? We buy the material in and convert it into plain labels. Obviously, we don't make the substantial modification. Do we then are we liable for the tax at the point of import then, if we're the importer of record on the paperwork?
If you are the importer of the material, you will be liable under the rule of you are the person importing it.
But you were saying earlier that you pay the tax at the point that substantial modification is made.
Or
do we have to?
Yeah.
So we do at the point of import.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because if you did a substantial modification, the tax point would move to when you did that.
Yeah. No,
the fact that you don't, it moves back to the next, what is regarded as substantial modification, or the fact that it's imported.
So it's the date of import.
Yeah.
Yeah. Lovely. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
And a further one, if the liner is recycled post-application, can the tax paid on this be claimed back?
No. Is the short answer. No.
Nothing we've seen today, I agree.
We haven't asked the question specifically, but I think under the rules that they've made, the answer is no. The answer is no.
Okay.
Sorry, sorry, Darren, just on that point, the question of is the material recyclable, is it actually recycled, is irrelevant as far as HMRC is concerned. All they're concerned about is, does the material contain a minimum of 30% recycled content at the start? What happens to it in the supply chain after the supply chain doesn't matter as far as HMRC is concerned.
Yeah, and bearing in mind, I think we mentioned it in the presentation, but you know, if a material is biodegradable, compostable, or any of those things, then it still counts as a plastic, and you still have to report on it. Are we doing any more questions?
No further questions. Over to you, Mika.
Yeah, no further questions. So thank you everyone for joining this breakfast briefing on PPT. If you do have any further questions, don't hesitate to email them through to the help desk, which is ppthelp@bpf.org.uk. Following this briefing, we'll share all the kind of the recording and the presentation and the direct link to the plastic packaging tax hub that we have on our website, which provides you all with kind of latest updates on what we've received from HMRC, and has a list of all the upcoming plastic packaging tax activities that we have going on. So keep you up to date as much as possible, as much as we can. But thank you all for joining, and hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.
Everyone, bye.